Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. Um, I'm Dr. Maisha, for those of you who don't know, um, and welcome to another live episode of the Black Mind Garden. I, you know, so there are the things that I plan to talk about, and then there are the things that I want to talk about. And, we've been doing a series on understanding personalities, particularly as people who influence children and young people, understanding their personalities in respect to our own. And so we've been doing this series. And for those of you who have been listening to those series, I was scheduled to do our last segment today. And I wanted to talk a little bit about something else. And so for many of you who are watching now, who are watching on replay, who might be listening, know that there was yet another um, school shooting incident. And, it just led me to think, and how I found out was through um, the principal of my son's school sent out a community message, um, expressing his sort of thoughts and his uh, heartfelt outpourings to the community in Nashville. And so, it got me to thinking, because this is, the work that I do. It got me to thinking about how when something like this happens, even if you're not directly impacted, um, even if we're not like directly impacted, we're impacted. And I want to talk about today just navigating the feelings, navigating the things that come up when there's trauma in community, and navigating trauma in community. Okay, so you know first, I just want to take a moment to just acknowledge and send love to the communities in Nashville, particularly to the families that were impacted in the school, and just send my love and condolences and energies there. There's nothing that I can say that will make it better, that will bring the children and bring the um, those educators back, those adults who lost their lives back. And I just want to take a moment to sort of acknowledge and send energy to them. So, when things like this happen, especially those of us who are, their parents or parent adjacent or educator who are in these systems of who are very impacted. And but that's not all. It's not the people who are in the community are the most impacted, who are directly impacted are the most impacted. And I think it's important and it's useful to understand that when we have these traumatic things happen in our society, that everyone is impacted. And, um, I think it's not always taken into consideration, that impact, especially for, uh, people who are already just trying to keep it together and take it one day at a time. So I want to talk a little bit about, the nature of what this is, and and feeling the feelings, right? Feeling all the feelings. So when things like this happen, there could be like a multitude of emotions that come up. You know, there's I know for myself, there's that shock, and then there's again, and there's this sort of anger and sadness, and then for some that the fear comes up, and it's important, number one, to just acknowledge that whatever feelings come up when things like this happen, whether you're closely related or not, are valid. I know that sometimes people say, well, gosh, I wasn't even directly impacted, why am I feeling this so much? It's because it is part of the human experience. It's that there's there's this compassion and that we have. It's the human sort of super conscious connectedness. And when and a lot of times when we see these things happen, we don't realize the impact that there is for us. And so there's how I like to talk about it. When I talk about it in trainings, I talk about it in the context of primary trauma, secondary trauma, and vicarious trauma. And then there's re-traumatization. And so I'm just going to like sort of talk a little bit about what that is and distinguish that, because I think it helps bring some context to why people who are various degrees. Hi, Dr. Don. I'm so glad that you could catch a live session as well. Why there are so many there's so many degrees of emotions, even when you're so many degrees of unrelated to the event or the person lost. So I'll kind of double back a little bit. When Stephen Twitch Boss, when he took his own life, there was a lot of feeling around that as well. And I talked about that in a previous podcast with Lynn Sturvant, who has been a recurring host. And again, we talk about this primary versus secondary versus vicarious trauma, and then there's re-traumatization. So primary trauma is what it is, the people who are directly impacted. So, if there's a sentinel event, a traumatic event that happens, and in this case, those people in the schools who were directly there, and the parents, that's that primary trauma. They're directly impacted, and then there's things to do to support them, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Then there's the secondary trauma, and I think that there's indirect trauma, what we call it indirect trauma. And there's two versions of that. One is secondary and one is vicarious, and you have this sort of re-traumatization, which I think kind of sits in the middle. Because for people who are re-traumatized, they experience a direct, they've experienced a similar direct impact, and it's not at that moment. So the secondary trauma comes with people who are supporting people who have experienced that direct trauma. So in the case of this type of loss, there may be direct family members. There may be, the first responders. These are people who are supporting those people who are directly affected by the event. And it's important, this gets recognized. It's important that people who support the people who are directly traumatized understand that there is a large level of impact that happens with being a direct support to people who are or experience this type of harm. And so then you have another type of indirect trauma called vicarious trauma. And if you know vicarious is like seeing through another's, it's like living through another's experience. And so then everyone else who sort of like sees this event, who hears about this event, could potentially experience or have an activation or experience this sort of vicarious trauma response. Now, it's important to understand that people are impacted, and not everybody experiences harm the same way, and not everybody experiences trauma in the same way. And so what may be traumatic to me may not be traumatic to another person. So it's important to kind of understand that. But the people like who are onlookers, this is the experience of vicarious trauma. And again, everyone is impacted in some kind of way by, well, everyone, I would suppose, is a generalization, but most people, I would assert, are impacted in some kind of way when events like this happen. And sometimes that vicarious trauma can also activate a re-traumatization. And what that means is that if you've experienced a similar incident, a similar type of trauma, then it reactivates that wound. It reopens that wound. So that means that and this is um, what's so important to get is that anyone now who has experienced something similar directly or indirectly, the people who are in the town of Valde, people who have in the town of any other place that's experienced a school shoot, even decades later, Columbine. So it's like it's a while ago. Will every time something like this happens, it re-traumatizes, it reopens that wound. And it makes sense for that to happen when it's a fairly recent event, meaning in the last 2 to 3, 5 years. But even decades later, things like this can re-traumatize and reopen wounds. So it's important to understand these sort of gradations, or these sort of this direct and this in the distinctions between direct and indirect trauma, because then, as a person who is not only in the experience and having the feelings, right, you're like wondering, well, why am I impacted in the way that I'm impacted? It is likely because you're in one of those types of experiences. And then, what then do you do? Like, how do you then take care of yourself? Right. So the first thing is to notice it, to notice, like, okay, this is what's happening, and to be able to name, like, oh, I'm impacted by this event, and to understand that sometimes that impact may not be um, immediate, because sometimes it's the shock of, sometimes it can happen, a couple of days later, sometimes it can happen weeks later, right? But to understand that when there are certain manifestations that you might experience that represent this sort of impact that you've had, and if you notice that you're getting a little bit less sleep than normal, or it's hard to fall asleep, or maybe you're a little bit more agitated, or maybe there's some anxiety there. Maybe there's even some like anger there. That is important to acknowledge, like, oh, this just happened. And that you're impacted in whatever way that you're impacted. It's also important to understand that, to recognize that in others as well. So you might notice that, so, like, if you're interacting with a parent, that they are maybe more anxious than usual, or if you're interacting with someone in a particular community who has experienced either similar trauma, or like even threats of school violence, then that still can be a re-traumatization, or an activation in some way. So it not only is important to recognize it in ourselves, but to understand that, because most people are going to be impacted when something like this happens, that it could cause a shift in behavior, a change in behavior, a shortening of fuse, a shifting of response, an upheaval of emotion. And so we need to be able to name that as well. And one of the things that I find useful is when I'm interacting with people in these types of scenarios, and I notice and what occurs to be like an emotional activation, to be curious, to inquire, especially if I can understand and regulate my own emotions in that moment, to be curious and inquire, like, what's going on? Are you okay? And sometimes they can't put their finger on it. Sometimes it's hard to put your finger on, but that button is there. And a lot of times it's unconscious, it's subconscious, right? So, what do you do when you recognize? Like, what do you do when you recognize, I'm more impacted than I thought? This is taking a toll on me. Well, I mean, I think the first thing is to connect. It's to recognize it, and then to a lot of times we tend to isolate out, isolate in, I should say, isolate in. Some of us tend to go in our heads, some of us tend to go in our homes, but it's natural to kind of want to pull in. And I think initially, if you need to take care of yourself and pull back, that's okay. But I think it's also very useful to connect, because that connecting, it actually helps you to recognize, to get an unconscious need met. And we are all humans and we all need to be connected. And whatever that may look like, it doesn't mean you have to talk it out. I mean, sometimes for some people, for the extroverts in the world, they may need to talk through it. For the introverts in the world, you may just need to be with someone, be in the space with someone, right? And I think that's it's we say in our world that connection helps to mitigate the impact of trauma. And so when these traumatic events happen, when we connect with people, whatever that safe connection looks like, and let me just you know put this element in, it's useful to know who are those people in your life who you feel safe connecting with in this way, right? So you can't just connect with anyone, but you want to find those people who you feel safe connecting with. Now, that could be family, that could be a friend, that could even be a therapist. Because there are some things that you may be able to talk about with a friend or a fellow parent or your spouse, your partner, or maybe there are not any immediate people that you feel comfortable with this conversation, and in that case connecting might be with a therapist. I think that's very important to recognize. And so once you feel like you've had that initial space of taking care of yourself, if you're the type of person that needs to pull back before you express, I am one of those people. I will go in before I go out. But what I've learned is to go out. So if you're and what we and an introverted on the introverted spectrum, it's important that you then at some point find some way to express that these feelings, and understanding that all of the feelings are valid. We all, this is really a grief on the grief spectrum, and there is the people who themselves who grieve, but then there's a community grieving that happens as well, and we need to honor that grief and honoring those emotions, because when we try to push them down or stuff them down, it doesn't do anything but stay in our bodies, and it actually becomes embodied in the cells. It like begins to stick there, and that's how what happens over time is we become primed for this. We become sort of like on high alert. And so when we begin to process through them and express to those people, like again, could be a therapist, could be a coach that you have, it could be a committed listener that you have, it could be a support community that you have. But when you begin to like allow yourself to process through and express, that helps to take it out of the body and take it out of the internal, and take it into the external and get that support that's needed. I think it's important to allow space and time for these types of things to move through us, because sometimes, and I can say that I am guilty of this for sure. um, it Sometimes when these uncomfortable emotions come, we just want to get over it, get through it, and get on with it, right? And um, sometimes that's not the most realistic approach, and it's not the most healthy approach. So it's to have compassion for the process, for the grief process that happens, and it looks different in everyone. There might be people who can move through it very quickly, and then because maybe they're already talking to someone and they can process it fairly quickly. But there may be people, and especially if you're experiencing sort of a reopening of a wound or re-traumatization, that it may take a little bit longer for things like that to move through you. So to allow time and allow space for for these things to move through you. Now, if you're in a work community, so this is for leaders inside of workspaces and communities, it's very, very useful and trauma informed to to provide safe community spaces for discussion. Maybe there's fireside chats that can happen. Maybe there are resources, therapeutic resources that you have available, that you make available for your employees, for your staff, and even leaders in organizations, executive leaders and CEOs. Don't count yourself out of needing to have that kind of support. I think that in the leadership communities and executive spaces, that there's an inaccurate conversation that needing support makes you weak, that feeling feelings makes you weak. I recently saw this post. It was a course on one of the platforms that talked about how do you be mentally tough and mentally strong. And I think there's a case to be made for, sort of letting go of that, having to be mentally strong all the time, and actually allowing ourselves to be emotionally fluent. Emotionally fluent. That's a lot of what I teach in my organizations to leaders and communities, is to be emotionally fluent and behaviorally flexible. So that means, what do you do to take care? What do you need to do to take care of yourself? And finally, I think that for us who are parents, um, we are going to feel the feels, feel how we feel about it, experience the grief of it, but we can't forget about our children. I mean, it's I think it's obvious to say that the children that are in those direct communities are impacted. Children who are in adjacent communities who have had those similar experience, we know will be impacted. And we can't forget about children who may not directly be in those communities, but are hearing it. And it's also important to understand that even if we're not talking about it around our kids, they are hearing about it. And so, to just watch and look out for um, different behaviors, or a little bit more emotionality, or a little bit more desire for affection or time from our children. And if you feel comfortable having the conversation, I think it's actually very useful um, to bring these conversations up. Like, did you hear about this? How are you feeling about that? And really check in, because we don't know unless we ask. And a lot of times as parents, we try to protect and shield our kids from these things that are happening in the world. But when these things are happening in the world are impacting our children, it's not useful or healthy to ignore it. It's actually it more empowering to actually have the conversation and be emotionally honest with our kids, it allows them to be emotionally honest with us. And we don't know what type of experience they're having until we have that conversation with them. And when we do, that's the best way that we can support them, by being honest and being open and saying, and getting what their experience is, because they could be in the background, you know, trying not to say something to us, afraid to speak on it, and experiencing their own anxiety and experiencing their own grief. So we want to make sure that um, as we are ourselves moving through the spaces, making sure we have the structures in place to take care of ourselves, emotionally regulate ourselves, we feel it's appropriate. It may actually be very useful to have these conversations with our children, and hear from them, talking to them and hearing from them. So that's really what I wanted to share today. Just, in light of everything, these are the kinds of, I teach trauma informed communication, and teach about trauma in multitude of spaces. And when things like this happen, it's important for, I think, people to understand the nature of how trauma shows up when things like this happen. And, what are some quick things that you can begin to do to support yourself, to support the people around you, to connect, I should say, with the people around you, and have each other support each other. And how can we support our children when, in essence, they're being indirectly impacted as well. And this is sort of this sort of communication, trauma informed listening and communication is the stuff that, that's in my sphere. So with that being said, if you have any questions, after, if you're listening live, you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat here. If you have any questions, if you're listening to the replay, please post them in the chat. I do check it. I would love your questions, your comments on how you take care of yourself during these times. What are some spaces that you go to connect after things like this happen? Some people may say they have church groups. Some people, I personally, I connect into my mom community because it's a shared experience, and we connect and we bond and we love on each other, and that's one of the ways that we heal together. I have several other communities that I connect in as well. I connect into my martial arts community and to my yoga community as well. So, what are some ways that you can connect in community that can be healing for you? That can be help you to experience that self care if you're in this vicarious trauma space. For those of you who um, are have children or parents, what are some ways that you support your children? How can you have these honest conversations with them? And I'm also um, welcoming questions for those of us, because I'm really speaking a lot to people who experience this indirect trauma, because I think that in the wake of these types of events, we often focus our attention, as should be, focus our attention on the community impacted and forget that we are impacted as well. Clearly, those who are directly impacted, I highly recommend therapeutic support, like therapists and counselors, um, especially for the primary and secondary people who are experiencing secondary trauma, first responders, the staff, the principals, the teachers, the students, the parents in those communities, in and around those communities, even school adjacent in those communities, to have direct support. And we cannot forget that those of us who are not directly in those communities, or who have either experienced this before or who are onlookers, we experience that same trauma. So I'd love to hear feedback. And of course, if you are in an organization or in a community or in a corporation, in a school or school district, and you want to know a little bit more about the work that I do, creating these trauma-informed conversations and trainings and development series, then just reach out to me, whether you're listening live or whether you're listening on replay. You can reach out to me directly on any of the platforms that I'm currently on, Facebook, LinkedIn, and or Instagram. And then, you can go to the website that you see here on the screen, mindremappingacademy.com. That's mindremappingacademy.com. And so with that, I will bid you adieu and wish you a safe and healthy and wonderful rest of the day and rest of the week. And we will talk again soon. Namaste.